happy to introduce to you Mark Flear, who is a reader, professor at Queen's University, Belfast School of Law. Mark researches and publishes widely social-legal studies, focusing in particular on medicine and health. To do so, he combines insights from social-legal studies with others from cognate disciplines, including science and technology studies. He makes extensive use of empirical research methods, which you see reflected in this paper, particularly ethnography. The primary sites for his research are law and regulation of public health and new health technologies at the global and European levels of governance. The key focus of his work is on biopolitics and citizen participation in legal and regulatory decision-making, in which he argues for the integration of lay and expert knowledges and expertise to improve the quality, accountability, and legitimacy of decision-making. As a major strand of his work, Dr. Flear is currently leading research on epistemic injustice. Justice done to someone in their capacity as a knower, with 2 edited books on this in preparation for Palgrave Sociolegal Studies. The first book is on epistemic injustice in spaces and places. The second one is on epistemic injustice and health law and bioethics. And so this chapter will be appearing in this.
In the first one.
In the first one. Okay.
Yeah, just to confuse matters.
So without further ado, Dr. Flear will present, and then I'll open it up for questions first with some questions from the students, and then we'll go to the audience.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And thank you then to Professor Lemons and to all of you for being here today. And if there's anyone online, thank you for bearing with us as we managed to, with some very helpful intervention there, get you with us today. It was actually nice to break the ice there with you a little bit. Sorry, let's get used to this. It's nice to break the ice with you a little bit just before we got going. I want to begin by giving you some background. So this, as we've just heard, is intended to be a contribution to a collection entitled Socio-Legal Studies of Epistemic Injustice in Spaces and Places. So it's the first of 2 collections that I'm working on that really center epistemic injustice. So that's injustice to someone and their status as a knower. And that relates very much to my research background. So it really extends my research interests. The concept epistemic injustice is derived from the work of Miranda Fricker. She published a book in 2007 that I'll be highlighting in a moment on epistemic injustice. And quite frankly, it's transformed a lot of the way I've been thinking about my own research. It's actually transformed a lot of how I've seen my own life experience in a number of regards. I won't speak to directly here, but right now. It's interesting to happen upon a concept that helps to inform oneself and one's own self-understanding, as well as then research. Taking that into research, I feel very lucky to have happened upon the concept, and I happened upon the concept. I think it was 2018-19. A bioethicist colleague and friend of mine, Richard Ashcroft, who's now at City University of London, commented on a paper I'd written, and actually said, "Well, you should go and look at this book, Epistemic Injustice. Have a look and have a think." And so I happened upon the concept really through a chat. Well, pretty much a really nice kind of chance interaction with a good colleague of mine, someone with whom I have worked quite often. And that, as I say, has been of personal benefit to me, but also is of growing professional benefit. This specific paper then is intended for that collection on epistemic injustice in spaces and places. But the data from this project, as I'll seek to underscore, I want to really try and acknowledge it now, actually comes from a project called Health Governance After Brexit, led by my dear colleague, Professor Tammy Harvey at City University of London, whom I know Professor Lemons has known for several years too. And also Tammy speaks very highly of you and the University of Toronto Faculty of Law and so on. But Tammy led that project. I was very lucky, I'm very lucky to be a part of that, and we're working on some final outputs, including a book on that project. But when we were looking through the data for this project, we actually came across, and actually it was Ivan Krantova, one of the researchers on the project, came across some interesting references made by our research participants relating to responsibility, their own responsibility, and also state responsibility for healthcare. And chatting a bit more with Ivanka, we decided that actually we might be able to say something interesting about responsibility, notions of responsibilisation, but also epistemic injustice. I will try to explain a bit further now. Now, bear in mind, I navigate between that and see my own notes on my laptop. I need my own notes on my laptop because otherwise I won't remember exactly what I need to say. So please bear with me as I navigate between the two. So here's the overview. So I'm really just going to get into it now and just try to elaborate a little bit on what I've just said. First of all, some background. So there's the background there. Since the late 20th century, in particular, there's been a focus on this idea of responsibilisation. It's become a key strategy of governance. What does this mean? What is this strategy? Well, through this strategy, state responsibilities and accountabilities in a range of areas, and they include health, reduce, even as governance expands and individuals come to bear responsibility and accountability. And again, that includes in relation to health, their own health, but perhaps health more widely, health outcomes. The contribution of this specific paper is, well, at the broadest level, aiming to bring together literatures on responsibilisation, I've just alluded to, and also epistemic injustice that I alluded to right at the outset. So this idea of a wrong done to someone in their status as a knower. Moreover, with literatures on space, place, and time. So this paper, this chapter, that's what I'm speaking to. It's very much in draft. It's middle drafts. It's will be redrafted over the next 8 months or so. But this paper is intended to contribute towards that contribution of epistemic injustice in spaces and places. So that's really bringing together then literatures on responsibilisation, epistemic injustice, and space, place, and time. I won't get too much into those latter literatures, there's a lot to say, but suffice to say that in thinking about space and place, you also need to think about time. Time is very much about making space and place. Now, if Professor Valverde were here, I would be saying hi, Professor Valverde, and acknowledging her work. So in particular, her work in chronotopes of law. There's also, there should also be another, where it's gone. Let's have a look. No, I can click something. Oh, there you go. That's an animation. This is the book Epistemic Injustice by Miranda Fricker, 2007, in hardback. This is probably the paperback version. This is Professor Valverde's work, Space, Place, and Time is really dealt with there. And this is underscoring the idea of time relating to Brexit. And so the data that I'm drawing upon today really comes from that project on health governance after Brexit. You've probably heard a bit about Brexit. I won't ask you what you think of it. That's for another time. Then ask me what I think about it, because that's for another time too. It'll take us away from what we're talking about. But I will be speaking to data drawn from Brexit time, really, from contributions by people, especially then on the streets, so to say. Now, in order to achieve this contribution, it's underscored down the slide, the chapter, this paper, seeks to do so by drawing upon that data from that project on health governance after Brexit. I'll say it's ethnographic data. It's actually more or less ethnographically inspired data, or data that's been gathered through ethnographic or ethnography inspired methods. I'll speak to that a bit more. In this project, we interviewed something like 400 people on the streets of towns in the north of England and Northern Ireland, two parts of the United Kingdom. We engaged in conversations with them in their status as patients or users of healthcare provided by the National Health Service in the United Kingdom in those two regions. And those two regions, they're specific spaces, places within the United Kingdom. They tend to be thought of as places that are left behind, as having left behind communities, people who have been left behind in a way to the forward progress of the economy and society and so on. In terms of those two places, so in the north of England, there, the the NHS provides healthcare through what's known as NHS England. I want to highlight, in relation to NHS England, there's a specific duty on the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care in England to promote a comprehensive health service. So there is a legal duty in what's known as the Health and Social Care Act of 2012. So there's law here. This is as much law as you'll get, though. But law will be our starting point, and then we'll move on. And there's another duty that the Secretary of State holds under Section 1 of that Act. They must exercise the functions conferred by this Act so as to secure that, I think should be those services, in accordance with the provisions in the Act. In respect of Northern Ireland, things are somewhat different. Within the United Kingdom, health is a devolved matter. So the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care is responsible for NHS England, but that's really still a central government competence or power. And in other parts of the United Kingdom, Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland, health has been devolved. So Northern Ireland, my home, it's Health and Social Care Northern Ireland that provides healthcare, but we, people in Northern Ireland, refer to the system as the NHS, right? So just to underscore this, at the start of the pandemic in particular, when we were going into lockdown and I think everyone was very scared, people were out on the streets. I think, was it on the Thursday evening, banging pots and pans and clapping. There were images of then Prime Minister Boris Johnson on the steps of Downing Street clapping. It lasted a while, but that was throughout the United Kingdom, and that included in Northern Ireland. And I can remember hearing it from my apartment. And let's just say it was very moving. It was very moving indeed. And I felt, oh my gosh, I'm not completely alone. There are other people out there. And we're in this together in some sense, even though we're in perhaps different boats, and we're all on the same choppy waters. Anyway, so in Northern Ireland, then it's Health and Social Care, NI, but we refer to the system as the NHS, and it's understood in those terms, although legally speaking, strictly speaking, then in terms of law, it's not the NHS, as far as we know. In Northern Ireland, the Health and Social Care, its Reform Act, Northern Ireland of 2009 provides for a general duty on the relevant departments, under which health and social care are covered. So duty to provide health and social care. And in particular then, the department shall promote in Northern Ireland an integrated system. That's under Section 2 as well. So the integration of health and social care less integrated in England. But this is our starting point. There's not going to be much more law, but just to say that law is relevant here. There are duties, legal duties, to provide and to secure the provision of health and or social care throughout the two places, the north of England and Northern Ireland, that we're looking at. I think I need to keep on bar. Let me just, no, that's taking me forward. Okay, just a second. Go on the Brexit buttons now. Yes, okay. Takes a while to get used to doing working two keyboards at once, but you can see the Brexit bus now, hopefully, everyone. Now, what I'm going to do then is actually look at how responsibility for the provision of healthcare is rendered in particular and key reform documents in relation to NHS England, but also Health and Social Care Northern Ireland. And then draw upon our data to see how essentially the data and people's views align in terms of responsibility and responsibilisation with what's in the documents. A key assumption in the reform documents, and they are the long-term plan for NHS England and delivering together Health and Social Care Northern Ireland, is that patients and users are autonomous individuals who are willing and able to take greater responsibility and accountability for themselves, but moreover, their ill health. And that's instead of relying on the state and its health institutions to look after them. I'll try and underscore that as I move forward. But that's essentially the key point in our view as the authors. When we look at the documents, that's the key assumption. We're going to then draw upon data to see whether that assumption carries over into what people have actually told us through our conversations with them. Let me tell you a little bit about our data. Our data was gathered in the period after the referendum on whether the UK should withdraw from the European Union but before the UK's actual withdrawal, which occurred on the 31st of January 2020. So we need to recall here, and this bus is key. This bus is really key. Are any of you familiar with it or anything to do with Brexit? Maybe not. I mean, it's not relevant to most of your daily lives, I imagine. But in the United Kingdom, in the lead up to the referendum, this bus was just about everywhere. Images of this bus and what it says. You can see what it says. We send the EU £350 million a week. Let's fund our NHS instead. I'll actually ask you, what do you make of that? When you read that, what do you think it's saying? And it could be anything. Just tell me what you think, please. Have a go. Yes,
well, I think it means that the money that is paid to the EU would no longer go there and would be put into health services.
That's what I think it says too. Yeah. What about you?
That was the same thing I was going to say. Yeah.
Right. Anyone else?
I think it also kind of suggests that the healthcare system is constrained.
It does indeed, yeah. They're constrained everywhere, aren't they? but yes, it does suggest that there's an assumption. I would agree with you underpinning that. How do you think the NHS? Yes, sorry.
Possible to mention like what the money is for. There's almost like this tacit idea that it's like being wasted or not being happy.
So I'll repeat that because for the benefit of those who couldn't hear. So I think you said that it suggests there's a tacit idea in this that the money's being wasted, that £350 million is being wasted by being sent to the European Union. Keep it in the UK, keep it at home, and it can be used to fund the NHS. That's the idea. Right, okay. That's interesting. That's what you think. And yes, please.
Also, that there's nothing coming back from the EU.
Yeah, there's that idea as well, which incidentally is of course not the case, especially in those so-called left behind areas. I can tell you, as I'm a Northern Irish person by residence these days, although I grew up in England, and peppered around Northern Ireland. I know also in places in England, but because I live in Northern Ireland, I do still see this. There are EU flags. This project, that project, was part funded by the European Union. So funds came back. Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to add to all of that when they say vote leave, it's almost insinuating like that money will go to this.
Yes.
Whereas that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah. I think it's the case that it hasn't gone. Actually, it hasn't worked out that way. So yeah, but there's a clear suggestion made. I don't think it's actually worked out that way. So yeah.
I find the use of our quite interesting.
Our.
It's not it's our kind of saying we are a part of this, which I think kind of obviously from your paper, but
right.
Interesting.
That is interesting, isn't it? Yeah, we're unpacking this, aren't we? Yeah.
The very bottom line, let's take back control, is very fascinating to me because it's kind of giving people the idea that like they control where the money goes rather than the government.
Let's take back control. And also there's an idea there, I would suggest, that actually we're not in, well, if being a member state in the European Union entails loss of control, whereas actually one of the arguments for being in the EU is that it's about a pooling of national sovereignty in order to ensure more control over certain aspects of life. Something else worthwhile saying is that the EU actually has very little say over healthcare, very little say. Healthcare systems are within the competence, the powers of EU member states. So that's an important, and that's an overall snippet to fill in some detail there that may not be readily available to you. So there's lots there, and you've picked up on an awful lot. Would you say, do you buy this? Would you buy this? Do you buy it?
The bus or the message?
Sorry?
The bus or the message?
Good question. Well, actually, I think it's quite a nice bus. It's quite snazzy. I like the red. I like the red. The message. Do you buy the? Are you convinced by it? I mean, are you convinced by it? No. There's lots of heads shaking for those of you that are online. If there's anyone online, or anyone that watches this in the future. Okay, we'll move on then. Thank you. Yes.
Speak about recent developments in the UK and how government in power actually has given over control to the private markets.
Oh yeah.
It's cynical.
I'll just remain silent here, and then silence sometimes is a lot more than saying, but also I'll get on, but yeah. Thank you for the responses, that's really appreciated. So I'm getting back a lot from you right now, and actually a lot of what you're saying came across in our data, our conversations with people on the streets in the north of England and Northern Ireland on the lead up to Brexit. So this buzz was circulating around the United Kingdom. As far as we know, it didn't make it over to Northern Ireland. But people, a good number of people, I can't give you specifics, but if you want the specifics, email me. But a good number of the people with whom we spoke actually did think or were under the impression that the bus made it over the water to Northern Ireland. As far as we know, it didn't. But it was almost omnipresent in the media, right? So they're informing the debate, and this, in a sense, was helping to frame the debate. The NHS and this bus were helping to frame the debate, how people were being asked to think about this question: should we leave the EU or not? Yes or no? Let me move on. So I'll just say a bit more about this. Well, you can see that there, what the bus says. So our data, it forms part of participant responses to this image. Our method, so what we actually did was as follows. We set up in towns in the north of England, specifically the towns of Rotherham and Sheffield, that's the north of England, and in Northern Ireland, specifically the towns of Newry and Derry. And in those places, we invited passers-by to chat. We explained who and what we were doing, and then we presented them with an image of this bus. It wasn't this image, but it was the bus, and it was a different background. I actually picked this image because there's lots of rubbish behind it, and I didn't choose this picture by accident, but that's for another day. Yeah, tells you something about how I think and feel about the whole thing. But anyway, another silence now. So that we presented them with this image on the bus and asked them what it brought to mind. So this is inspired by ethnography, and we can speak about that another time for those of you that are interested. After concluding our chats, we recorded some immediate so-called scratch notes just there and then in the field, providing as much information as possible from our interactions with the participants and what they said, our impressions of the participants, as much as we could say as possible in terms of maybe their sex, gender, age, maybe what their backgrounds were, things like that. Any information they revealed to us. And of course, otherwise, this is not anonymous. We didn't take names or anything like that, but just information about the people we spoke to, our impressions of age as well, also very important. We then returned to our desks, to our rooms, and recorded this information and later coded it and extracted from it a number of key things. And one of them, through conversations in particular with Ivanka Antova, who was the research fellow on the project, and also a former colleague of mine in the School of Law, and now a very good friend of mine. Through our conversations with Ivanka in particular, this idea, this theme of responsibility came out. And we found it very interesting that people, unprompted by us to talk about or speak to ideas, notions of responsibility, actually started speaking to it, this concept, this notion of responsibility. But more than that, perhaps responsibilisation, so how they might or ought to be made responsible for their own health and their own health outcomes, and how that relates to the responsibilities and accountabilities that they as individuals, but also the state may have, and how they're related, the broader distribution of responsibilities and accountabilities for health and healthcare. Now, I want to stress this because part of the intention behind the paper is to contribute towards academic literatures on space, place, and time. The image of the bus was shown within this so-called transition period where we'd voted to leave the European Union, but actually hadn't then at that point left the European Union. So this was a transition point. And maybe if I give you a little bit of background, suffice to say the discussion about the result of the referendum in the United Kingdom was very heated indeed. There was lots of discussion around the potential, I don't think this is too strong, rigging of the vote in the sense that, well, maybe falsehoods were told by certain former British prime ministers who wrote opinion pieces and who were said to have actually written 2 opinion pieces, but then published the one that was on the side of leaving, rather than the one that was on the side of staying, for instance. So lots of discussion there about personalities and I suppose personalities then, and veracity, public trust in official figures, all sorts of things. It was quite a time. I don't know if you followed it. Did any of you follow it? Or were aware of the state of the discussion in the UK? Anyone at all? Yeah? What were your impressions of it?
Well, among other things, I think that Boris Johnson could have gone for either side early on in his career.
Yeah.
And he chose the one that would give him the most prominence. And I always thought that it would be highly disruptive of the British economy. I didn't realize the difficulties between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. I didn't totally appreciate that. And that wasn't really brought out in the discussions before the Brexit vote.
And so for the benefit of those who maybe are online and can hear that there's an important point there about, in particular, Northern Ireland and the south of Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, and the potential for disruption on the island, in particular relating to trade, but then more broadly, peace and prosperity on the island, which is something that's been very hard won over the last 20, 30 years after the so-called Troubles. It conveys that word, the Troubles, probably much of what it's entailed for people that lived in Northern Ireland and to some extent the south of Ireland during the time when there was a lot of upheaval, violence, death, destruction. Yeah, the potential implications of the UK leaving the EU for stability, peace and stability on the island, in particular Northern Ireland, wasn't appreciated, and I think arguably still isn't appreciated by the UK government. Yeah, but yes.
So has there been a significant, because there are a lot of debaters around also how it may reinvigorate desire to unify the island? Has there been an uptake of nationalism? And
I think there's been an increase in debate about unification of Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, or Ireland, as Ireland calls itself, of unification on the island. There's more discussion about that and what that might look like, because there would have to be a radical reimagining of whatever state came afterwards. However, so there's that, but there's also a polarization of debates in Northern Ireland in particular, where segments of the population really want to remain part of the United Kingdom and are very concerned about what Brexit has meant for their position in the United Kingdom. Yeah, so there's that going on. It's a far more complex debate than I can enter into now, but this is part of the background for what we're talking about. And it was very important for our participants in Northern Ireland. Yeah, they are acutely aware of what Brexit may entail for them and for Northern Ireland, and however they see themselves, whether it's as nationalists or as unionists, or in the extremes, Republicans or so-called loyalists. So these are the more extreme positions, I think that's fair to say. And they're the positions that tended to take up violence, actually, in the Troubles. But yeah, there are big questions, very important questions that haven't been answered, and they probably will never get the answers. We're probably working towards them, but that's part of the background. So temporality, time, informing this particular space and place. So the data was gathered at a very particular time. People in Northern Ireland in particular are acutely aware of the implications of Brexit for their position, just in the islands, the United Kingdom and Ireland and the other islands that make up that archipelago of the northwest of Europe, what it means for their lives, but more particularly, what it might mean for the NHS, actually, for the distribution of responsibilities and accountabilities for health and healthcare post-Brexit. It's funny, isn't it? So these big questions, and they somehow also narrow down to a finer point, a more particular set of questions relating to responsibility for health. We think that this specific space, place, time during which our data was gathered may have informed feelings that then fed into what people were telling us. So some of what I will report to you, and it's really just taking key examples, there's a lot more in the paper itself, and for those of you that have got a copy, you'll see that. But yeah, I think there are echoes anyway in what people said somehow. Space, place and time do seem to come through. What I'm saying here, by the way, it's really more than is in the written version of the paper you have in front of you. When I was flying across the Atlantic yesterday, I was in the process of rewriting this presentation and kind of getting to the next draft of the paper itself, what will be a chapter. So yeah, I just want to acknowledge that. Okay, let's move on a little bit. I have to now click this. Okay. Indeed, it says, our data appears to demonstrate a number of key things in particular. Recognition by patients and users in these particular places, left behind communities in the north of England and Northern Ireland, of responsibility in terms of attributability for health outcomes. Now, this is an important way of thinking about responsibility. Attributability for health outcomes is a sense of responsibility where individuals cannot be blamed and censured by the state for not fulfilling those kinds of responsibilities. That's a very particular kind of responsibility. So responsibility as, yes, somebody, I'm this health outcome, it's attributable to my own poor behaviour, say, whatever that means. So people seem to be saying to us that they saw responsibility as, well, they didn't say this explicitly, but they seem to be suggesting that they thought of responsibility in more complex terms than rendered in those key reform documents. In those key reform documents, as I've tried to highlight, the notion of responsibility coming forward seems to be more in terms of responsibility as accountability. That is to say, where individuals can be blamed and censured by the state for health outcomes that may be related to their own, or in particular those related to their own behaviours. And this may lead, for instance, censure may lead then, or may involve the state deprioritising certain people, say because they eat too much, or because they smoke, or they drink, or whatever. Engage in behaviours that are deemed, for whatever reason, and these reasons are problematic, not okay, or not what somebody ought to be doing if they're looking after themselves. This more complex understanding of responsibility then, so not just as accountability, when the state can censure individuals, but attributability, when the state won't and shouldn't be censuring individuals, may reveal how patients and users are wronged as people capable of contributing views, that is, as knowers, on the appropriate distribution of responsibilities and accountabilities relating to state-funded healthcare. In other words, patients and users face hermeneutical injustice and marginalisation before injustice within and through the reform proposals. That's what I'm going to try to say. Now, what does hermeneutical mean? Well, it's to do with the tools of shared social interpretation. So if we're being marginalised in terms of the tools of shared social interpretation, that can lead to injustice, a sense in which our status as knowers is disregarded. What we have to say, what we know, what we think is somehow outside the frame that dominates here reform proposals in relation to healthcare. So there's a lot to say, and I'm going to try and advance this paper in the following. So hopefully you can see that a little bit is missing from the top. But never mind, we can't do anything about that.
Down if you prefer.
Can we? Does it go down a bit more? Oh, can I do so? Oh, you can do that, can't you? Just so everyone can see everything. Sorry, I'm not. Not very tech savvy. Ah, okay then. It was as simple as that, everyone. Just dragging a box down to the bottom of the screen. Who would have thought it? Right, what does it say here? Oh, we've gone too far ahead. Let me go backwards. Oh, it's something. How do we? Should be able to go backwards. Why can't I? Oh, there we go. I'm okay now. I'm fine. Thank you.
You're fine?
Yes,
Okay.
thank you very much. Thanks for your help. Yeah, I went too far ahead. This is what I intended to convey to you. So the long-term plan for England, NHS England even. So we actually went to the north of England, and you can't really see that, but it's actually a big place. There's 14.5 million people there. How many people live in Canada?
38 million.
Is it that many now? Oh gosh, I didn't realise it had grown. So fast or so big. I thought it was a bit less than that actually. But okay. But it's 14.5 million people live there. That's a lot of people. According to this, that's more people than Belgium, which I think was at least where you were raised. Portugal, Greece, Hungary, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Czech Republic, Ireland, that's the Republic, Austria, Finland, Lithuania, and many others. And it's certainly much bigger than Scotland. It says that's actually true. And certainly much bigger than Northern Ireland in the UK. We've got, I think it's 1.9, just under 2 million people.
How many does it say? How many?
14.5. 14.5.
Yeah.
14.5 million. That's a lot of people. A lot of people. Oh, and I know I'm not in the United States, so I'm not, this isn't in a sense some sort of epistemic injustice going on. Only 4 of the 50 states of the United States, that's California, New York, Texas and Florida, have more people than the north of England, apparently. There we go. I learned that on the way here. So I thought that was interesting. Anyway, so it's an important place to go. That's what I'm trying to underscore. But it's also a left behind place, or a place with left behind communities. If you were to travel through the north of England, you would see lots of social deprivation. There are also places of great wealth. Concentrations of wealth, but there are lots of areas where there would have been lots of heavy industries, shipbuilding, manufacturing. A lot of that's gone now. And as a consequence, there's been an attempt to bring in new jobs and high-value jobs, but there's a lot of social deprivation. Of course, a lot of the economic activity in the UK, actually not just recently yet, but I think it's going back a good time, and it's been an ongoing struggle. Over 100 years, it's been an attempt to try and get economic activity spreading out from London, the southeast of England, which generates an awful lot of the wealth for the whole of the United Kingdom. And there's distribution of the wealth generated there across the United Kingdom. That's up to Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland just here. This is not part of the United Kingdom. This is the Isle of Man. It's a crown dependency, and there's others. Anyway, it's a funny part of the world. Even if I do say so myself. So there you go. It's a place though where there's great social deprivation. The same goes for Northern Ireland, and I'll come to Northern Ireland eventually, but I want to focus on the long-term plan for NHS England. So it's in the name, that long-term plan relates to the whole of England. Health isn't a devolved matter in respect of England. It's still held, powers are held in Westminster. We have a Secretary of State for Health and Social Care. He's essentially the Secretary of State with responsibility for NHS England, right? This is how things are. Now, in the long-term plan for NHS England, which applies to the north of England, prevention is a key example, I'm going to suggest to you, where we can see responsibilisation taking place. Prevention is vital to reducing demand on services, in particular then with responsibilisation emerging through references in the long-term plan to action to, this is a direct quote, ramp up support for people to manage their own health. These are echoed in some related documents. One's called Advancing Our Health, Prevention in the 2020s. This is a so-called green paper. Going back then to the long-term plan, prevention is framed as part of a more general pre-existing trend where, and this is quoting from the long-term plan, people are already taking control themselves, supplemented with expert advice and peer support in the community and online. And this is described, another direct quote, as part of wider moves to what the King's Fund calls shared responsibility for health. But this goes, we're arguing in the paper, beyond responsibilisation as attributability towards accountability. So that's the idea that the state can then censure individuals where they can be blamed then in certain respects. Other examples of moves towards such a focus on individual control and individual responsibilisation come through shared responsibility relating to the prevention and management of conditions such as diabetes, asthma, and respiratory conditions. It seems that involves or includes COVID-19. I'm just thinking here, actually, just out loud, people with so-called long COVID seem to have been left by the way, even though they're suffering. It's emerging as a condition. I think it's not quite been recognised as a condition, at least in the UK. So people with long COVID are in a bit of a precarious situation, I think. I think in terms of, say, disability law, their situation isn't recognised as a disability, perhaps. Because the state of knowledge around the condition is forming. It's forming. We're not quite in a place where we can say this is a disability. It's something. I think the legal definition is of something that affects people for at least 12 months. Whereas, of course, we can see that clearly affects people for a long time. But still, that's the state of scientific knowledge. Other examples where there are moves towards individual control and responsibilisation include in relation to maternity and parenting and common mental health problems. Several developments become of renewed significance within the long-term plan, and that's essentially because they're about enabling individuals to be responsible, to become responsible and accountable even for their own health. These include health information to facilitate their own individual decision-making, digitisation of healthcare to facilitate remote administration, and that includes or in relation to personalised medicine, so-called. This is all presented as about empowering people. People are empowered through these trends. Also, other developments include support services in the community, so-called social prescribing, and that's to reduce the non-medical causes of ill health through non-medical interventions in the community. Oh, no, I can't do this, can I? Okay, sorry. Trying to navigate two keyboards, and also I'm a bit jet lagged, so have sympathy, thanks. Northern Ireland now, okay? So we've talked about England a little bit. There's a lot more in the paper itself, a lot more examples that try to underscore how the ideas of responsibility for health seem to be about individuals taking more and more responsibility for their own health. And this isn't just responsibility as attributability, it's to do with accountability, right? So individuals are potentially opening or being opened up to censure, to blame and censure for their own, in inverted commas, poor behaviours. Again, the question whether it's actually their own and they can be actually responsible for some of these things. But you know, moving on. These aren't my. I did not write those documents. This is my or the co-author's interpretation of the documents. What they're saying. The key document in respect of reform of health and social care in Northern Ireland is Delivering Together. And that's in respect of health and social care in Northern Ireland. A lot of, well, quite a few at least, of the things I just highlighted in respect of the reform of health and social care and reform documents of health and social care, that's what it is, the NHS England, are found in respect of delivering together. One imagines actually the people that write these things read a lot of the same literatures and are in touch with each other, sit on maybe some shared committees. But anyway, there are a lot of similarities. One is in respect to prevention. This is in itself, as I've just said, a key way of responsibilising patients and users. It's also a building block for wider changes that extend, in our view, responsibility and seemingly accountability through the organisation and delivery of health and social care, healthcare in particular, in Northern Ireland. Indeed, there is a focus on the systemic conditions, the very organisation and delivery of health and social care, in particular healthcare in Northern Ireland, some of which have already been noted in respect of what I've said as regards the long-term plan for the NHS in England. And this is to do, these systemic conditions are about enabling responsibilisation of individuals for their own healthcare. So direct credit here in respect of delivering together for Northern Ireland, ensuring that people are supported to keep well in the first place, with the information, education and support to make informed choices and take control of their own health and well-being. Elsewhere within delivering together, it said that all citizens should be supported to make healthier and better informed life choices. The so-called social prescribing approach that I've mentioned in respect of NHS England in the long-term plan is also found in delivering together. And that's through an emphasis on making services more accessible by, for instance, placing pharmacy hubs in communities, improving family services and building capacities in communities so that patients and users of health and social care in Northern Ireland, the NHS in Northern Ireland, are able to take greater personal responsibility for themselves and presumably others. Overall, in respect of NHS England and, do I now have to, yes, there we go. There's a bubble. Overall, in respect of NHS England and health and social care Northern Ireland, such references may be about conceiving responsibility in terms of attributability for health outcomes. They may be, but we think, having read these documents closely, and there are more examples, as I say, given in the written paper, we think that the repeated and strong focus in the documents on responsibilities of patients and users within the context of the distribution of responsibilities across institutions and society suggests that responsibility is also being firmly linked to accountability. So not just individuals being attributable for ill health and that health outcomes, but also being opened up to being held accountable, to blame for health outcomes, for their own, well, esteem, their own ill health. I just like stutter sometimes. I have problems around certain words, and that's one of those. It comes out when I'm tired. So there you go. Ill health, there we go. It came out at that time. So does that make sense so far? Our view is that the documents are about trying to make individuals more responsible in terms of being accountable for their health and health outcomes. But what do people actually think? The people that we spoke to, and with whom we spoke about the topic Brexit, this bus. What do they think about responsibility for health and their own individual responsibility for health? Well, I will try to summarise some of our data. I'm really going to highlight two key examples. In the written paper, I tried to highlight more examples and just try to underscore in the paper that actually we've got a number of people saying very similar things, and we highlight a few more examples in the paper, but this is just condensing things down really as far as I can go in these few minutes. I'm just conscious of time. I've been speaking for quite a while. Sorry if I'm going well over time, but so what are the people we spoke to, with whom we spoke? What do they have to say? Well, we spoke with a number of participants in the north of England and Northern Ireland. I just told you, something like 400 people. On the streets, I spoke about the particular research method, what it involves. I've shown people an image of that bus, just asking them, well, what does it bring to mind? What do you think? And people said many of the things that you said, actually, in respect of what it brought to mind. And they actually used some very colourful language. I'll put it that way. Do you understand my meaning if I say colourful language? Swear words were uttered. And I won't be repeating them now. I might be ejected from the building, I might be ejected from Canada, who knows, for bad behaviour. Who knows? Right, let's just delve into the data. Again, this is just a snapshot, but it's representative of what we found. So we spoke to a series of participants they appeared to express a view that healthcare should be both an individual and a state responsibility. So this is a more complex thinking, or set of thinking about responsibility perhaps than is given in the documents that I've just tried to summarise to you. So it's important here to go to the words actually uttered by our research participants. So I'm going to quote this one participant from Sheffield. I think it was a woman. I took out biographical information. Perhaps that's a bit problematic, actually, having thought about it. But I was over the middle of the Atlantic, so I was just rewriting this as I went. I thought I'll just take out what's perhaps extraneous matter, just for right now. Anyway, this person, as I say, I think it was a woman, said, people should be responsible for their own health and make healthier lifestyle choices. So it was a she, argued that euthanasia should be allowed. There's a big debate in Canada, of course, ongoing, but that's not for now. People should invest in their health. The responsibility for health lies with the individual. She mentioned growing expectations of the NHS and that it's a bottomless pit, that we should stop throwing money into it. People should not rely on the government the whole time. The government should put a high tax on sugar. Whether Brexit comes or not, we should take responsibility. Lots of questions. Who's we here? So lots of questions that could be asked. But this is coming directly from those scratch notes, so you can see what was happening in the field. It's the immediate impressions, trying to record as much information as possible. It's not particularly, it's not the best articulated quotes. Well, this is a rendering of what was said. So it's not a direct quote, it's not verbatim here. But it's maybe not in the best, clearest English. So this is the researchers' rendering of what was said by the research participants. So these are really the researchers' words. So you can see how complex things can get. But this is our take on what we were told, on what was being said. Now here, we think that although there's a strong stress in what was being said on individual responsibility, it appears to be motivated by concerns about demands on the NHS. And it may recognise attributability for health outcomes rather than accountability. This doesn't necessarily align neatly with what those those reform of the NHS documents have to say, in particular relating to England. This may in turn suggest that a participant and others who hold this view, so a number of people echoed this view, are subject to hermeneutical marginalisation. So their views don't fit within the concept that's being rendered within the reform document. They're somehow placed outside of thinking about them by the government. Does that make sense? What the government is proposing is not necessarily held by those people. They're placed outside of a concept that underpins reform. This, moreover, may amount to epistemic injustice. So injustice to these research participants and their status as knowers. They've got a particular understanding of responsibility, what is appropriate responsibility what's an appropriate distribution of responsibility and accountability in respect of health, in respect of healthcare. But it may not actually be reflected in the policy documents themselves. That's our view. More in the vein of responsibility as accountability, collective responsibility is also invoked. So we think we should take responsibility is more about responsibility as accountability. So we think there's a more complex picture here. There's attributability, so there's a recognition by individuals, a number of the individuals with whom we spoke, of, yeah, okay, they, the participants, are responsible in terms of their health outcomes being attributable to how they live their lives, what they eat, whether they smoke and how much they drink and so on. Yeah? But there's also maybe recognition of accountability. Maybe they should be accountable for those health outcomes. But things aren't as clear-cut, perhaps, as they are in the policy documents that inform the future direction of travel in respect to the distribution of responsibilities and accountabilities for health in NHS England. Moving over to Northern Ireland, and I will be coming to a close soon. A woman in Newry, so that's in the south of Northern Ireland, and it's very close to the border with the Republic of Ireland. The woman there made the argument that we are responsible for our health as much as the government is. Now we think that such comments, and there are a number of similar comments, may distribute responsibilities between individuals and the state but they leave the type of responsibility, so that's attributability or accountability or a blend, somewhat unclear. So we get a more complex picture and understanding of what responsibility is and maybe what it should look like in terms of shaping the future. Right, I think if I click here now, reflection. Yeah, I think I've said that much more or less about it. So our overall view, and again, I'm trying to navigate between this and my notes, is that there is a misalignment, that might be one way to put it, between how the responsibilities of individuals, that's patients and users of healthcare in Northern Ireland and the north of England, are rendered within those reform documents, a mismatch, a misalignment between the rendering there and what people actually think about what is or should be their responsibility in respect of health or healthcare. Misalignment might be one way to put it. Now let me reflect a bit more here. Do I press this? Yes. Overall, okay, so I'll just speak to this. So the views expressed in our data, they emerged at a very particular time, from a very particular time, and in very particular spaces and places. So this was in the period after the vote to leave the European Union and before the United Kingdom actually left the European Union. So Brexit was very much on people's minds, but for some reason, we don't get into this, people started talking about the NHS and responsibility for health without any prompting by us, except showing them that image. But we think this is interesting in and of itself. Moreover, in brief, and as I've said, we think that the views expressed by our research participants, so that's again on the streets of Northern Ireland, England, don't seem to align neatly, perhaps not even at all, with the conceptualization of patient and user responsibility in the documents for reform that I tried to summarize earlier in this afternoon's paper. But there's a question. Does this reveal epistemic injustice? And how does this reveal, indeed, epistemic injustice through our research method, which is what we're calling street legal ethnography? So going to talk about, or talk to people in the streets, record as much about what they say and our impressions of them as possible, and then go from there. Well, our analysis seems to illuminate, so shine a light over a number of things. First, the potential for hermeneutical marginalisation of and hermeneutical injustice towards patients and users, the patients and users with whom we spoke. And that is to say that their conceptualization of their responsibilities isn't necessarily found within the reform documents. So this is why we think there's a marginalisation there, what they think is marginalised, and this can be understood as a hermeneutical marginalisation. But moreover, injustice. Injustice because their status as knower seems to be ignored. What they have and what they think about responsibility and their own individual responsibility and the responsibility of other patients and users seems not to be reflected, at least straightforwardly, in those key policy documents. Now, I was thinking and writing a lot of this somewhere across, or in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, or over the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. I was like, oh gosh, the juices are flowing again. But this is probably not the most articulate expression of the thoughts going through my mind, but I'm going to put them out there and just underscore again that the written version that went around is an earlier version and my thoughts are evolving, and I really hope there's time, although I've ran over and started late, to try and start unpicking and discussing a bit more. But this is a particular thought that I had, that the scale on and across which the conceptualization of responsibility within those reform documents operates, and the duration of time over which, and even the pace of time at which the conceptualization in those documents operates, is probably different than what our data, or the time within our data, if that makes sense. The documents are a particular rendering of responsibility that may almost be, in a sense, out of time because they continue a lineage, a way of thinking about responsibility, distribution of responsibilities and accountabilities that actually stems from the late 20th century and maybe before that to some extent. So it's a longer span of time and operating over a far larger scale. So not just the north of England, but the whole of England. Actually, we're just looking at Northern Ireland and places in Northern Ireland. So it's a bit different in respect to Northern Ireland, but the scale is far broader. And because we're looking at what's in documents, those documents may almost place the concept of responsibilisation, of responsibility for health and healthcare, almost out of time. When we think about law-related documents, we might tend to think, and it's been written a lot in the academic literature, and also involving discussions with members of the public, that when members of the public at large, also people involved in law, maybe law professors, think about the law, we tend to think of law as almost timeless. And it's not necessarily thought of as a product of certain times and places and spaces and people and so on. It's sort of almost timeless, and that's where part of the power of law comes from, and law-related discourses, such as in these reform documents. They do relate to the delivery of those duties, those legal duties that I started the paper just highlighting, right? So there's something more to think about here that I really haven't got to the conclusion of, but I started thinking about. There's something more I need to unpick. Now, that said, in spite of this, creating legitimate health governance after Brexit requires that the concepts underpinning it, and that includes how we think about responsibility and the appropriate distribution of responsibility and accountability, or responsibilities and accountabilities for health and healthcare, I'm going to say, or should be rooted in, and they should be aligned with the widest possible range of views across the whole of the territories over which they apply. So what I'm trying to say here is that in respect of NHS England, the ways in which responsibility and accountability are thought about in policy, law and policy indeed, should reflect the widest possible range of views of patients and users, and not just a limited or more limited range of individuals or groups of individuals. And the same goes for Northern Ireland. I think this actually involves perhaps re-articulating and bringing ideas of responsibility, in a sense, back into a sense of their spatial and place-based and very more specific time-based dimensions. Bring them back so they reflect how people feel or what they think now. I think, moreover, then, provide space for individuals to have more of a say and to have their views reflected in law and policy documents, so that they're not marginalised. We don't have what we've argued or been trying to argue, a sense of hermeneutical marginalisation, but also a sense of hermeneutical injustice or epistemic injustice, a place where, or a sense in which individuals are subject to injustice in their status as others. We should try and work against that as much as possible. So hopefully that's brought things to a nice conclusion. With that, I will end.
Yes, for sure. Thank you. We have some time for questions, so I'll call on Monica Jill.
So it's a little bit wordy, but I'll try my best.
Well, I was just wordy, so thank you for.
So you identify in the chapter that responsibilization strategies within the reform documents assume that patients are able to take greater responsibility and accountability for themselves and their ill health. However, for many disadvantaged people like those in poverty, this would be an extremely difficult task. The responsibility is basically being put on people who can't bear it. So this becomes, of course, even more problematic to me when I consider that responsibilization almost seems like an out for the government to basically they don't have to provide some degree of services. So it's just kind of a general question of whether in your research you considered kind of how responsibilization could interact with this advantage, or if you have any general thoughts on that.
So in this specific chapter, we don't attend to that question in any great depth, but we are aware, well, except that and it perhaps needs to be teased out. We are engaged with people in so-called left behind, this is inverted commas, this is the policy speak, left behind communities, that's the speak, that's the way of rendering people in those places, perhaps regardless of their own particular disadvantage or privilege or whatever, but they're in these left behind places, and that's how they're conceived. But having spoken to them, I suppose there is an implicit recognition in the chapter that, of course, disadvantage is important. Maybe some of the people with whom we spoke weren't particularly disadvantaged, but some of them clearly were. And we are sensitive, I think, just in the framing of the piece by focusing on left behind communities, left behind places, spaces, left behind, came through, we're sensitive to how certain people are perhaps being asked to do more than their capacity as individuals may allow them to. That, I think it comes across, it may be in places in the chapter, but not as clearly as possible. And that's perhaps more to do with the framing of the chapter, what we intend to do in it. But yes, I mean, I think there's just a general critique there that this idea of responsibilization of individuals, it doesn't really fit well with our recognition that certain individuals are just less capable of being responsible. And of course, in the policy documents, people are to be enabled to be responsible. But then maybe they still can't be. And then what about them? So there's a broader discussion there. And I do need to think a bit more with my co-authors, although I'm the lead author, so it's my main responsibility. To really try and think through those sorts of questions and I suppose how we want to attend to them a bit more. But so what you're alluding to here is this far broader debate and discussion. And I mean, early in, say, medical law and ethics, so I teach that at my home institution, and maybe you teach it similar. We talk about, well, the rationing of scarce, if they are indeed scarce resources. So there's a question, are they actually scarce? Anyway, but this idea that there is to be a rationing, how is it to be achieved? And questions around responsibility and accountability. But it relates very much to these broader discussions. Yeah, did that help or answer? Yeah, thanks.
So my question is, you talked a lot about how conversations with patients revealed a misalignment in their understanding of the distribution of responsibilities for healthcare compared to that in policy documents. I was wondering if you have any ideas of some actions that can be taken by the government, such as through consultations and whatnot, to ensure that the views of those in these marginalized and left behind communities are indeed reflected in these policy and legal documents.
That's a great question, and thank you for that. I mean, they're all great questions, but that particular question, it's part of what the broader edited collection that the chapter's part of. So not just identifying epistemic injustice, but how do we deal with it? How do we reduce it? How do we even prevent it from happening? So thank you for that. Consultations might be part of the way forward. I think actually, this is rather self-serving, but the sorts of research that academics do is important. And this is one of the ways that it can be important, because we have data that underscores a particular problem that we hope government will listen to. I'm actually part of some broader work. With the Nuffield Trust, I'm working with a number of people, maybe even some of them are watching this online if they've got time, and they might be chuckling along now. But picking up the Nuffield Trust led work. But through that, we're trying to draw attention to some of the downsides of Brexit, in particular for Northern Ireland, and at the same respect of access to medicines. Whether or not government will listen is a different question, because of course, those in position of power, they've got particular agendas and also ideological perspectives that shape even what they listen to. But that's part of what this work on epistemic injustice is intended to say, well, or deal with, or just say, well, look, you need to hear, or if you don't, there's potential here for epistemic injustice. That's a wrong in itself, but moreover, it can lead to other kinds of wrong or harm, right? People maybe don't get the treatment that they need, in particular if they're disadvantaged people. right? They may not be able, some people may not be able to take responsibility in which they're urged to take responsibility. Well, they can then be disadvantaged. But underlying that, say in terms of not being able to access the treatment that they need, or being given the treatment that they need, underlying that we're saying maybe epistemic injustice. So if we listen to people in the first place, then maybe we can stop these other harms from arising. But your question is about, well, how do we get government to listen? Academic work, drawing it to the attention of people in positions of power, coming to great law school, faculties rather, this is a faculty, it's a school back home, and just speaking and highlighting our research and hoping people will listen, and writing pieces for the media, trying to, and that's what we're doing as part of the Nuffield Trust work. There's a link there, this is linking with that work, just writing pieces. And actually, for the Nuffield Trust work, part of what we've been saying recently in a policy document, and that does relate to epistemic injustice, trying to overcome or address epistemic injustice, was picked up by the BBC, the UK's, the main broadcaster, the national broadcaster, it's not the only broadcaster, the state broadcaster, say, or it's funded by the licence fee payer. So I think there are a range of different things that we can do, but always being aware that those in position of power, their way of seeing the world is going to be filtered through a certain lens or lenses, ideologies part of it. And so we may not actually break through, unfortunately. So maybe we need to be voting for the people that will listen. But then, yeah, anyway.
So I'll take the last question, but we then have to move quickly out of the room because at 2:10 another class starts. But I'll take the last question. There are a lot of great questions. I will give it to Professor Flear, and he can respond to some of you individually. But maybe very briefly your question, Faison, and then we'll conclude. Yeah, we're Faison. Yeah. Okay.
My question was in relation to how kind of COVID-19 pandemic.
Can you speak up a little bit?
Was kind of like how the COVID-19 pandemic affects our conceptions of responsibilization. So, for example, there was this idea that we're going to stop the curve, but also that we have to protect the NHS as citizens. We have the responsibility to max up and get vaccinated. So, on a kind of initial level, I definitely agree with your thesis. But my question is like, at an ultimate level, do we truly agree with it in our hearts? Kind of that, yeah, because there was this idea that, well, if you didn't mask up and get vaccinated, despite formal kind of legal right to citizenship and those kind of obligations, you're not going to get proper priority in healthcare, or for some reason you somehow disallowed your right. And then also this conception of, being part of the epistemic conception of healthcare decision making, as opposed to kind of delegating either to the private market, like Professor Lemon said, but then also delegating it to public health, which is equally unaccountable from a kind of democratic perspective. So it's kind of like, how do we make sense of those complexities?
What's my immediate response? I'm not sure. There's a lot there. So I'll just take the first part of what you said, if I may, because there's a lot to unpack there, and time is limited. We do have to leave the room, I believe. How, COVID-19, and so this is, I suppose, going more broadly, how has it affected notions of responsibility and perhaps responsibilization? Individuals becoming more and more responsible for their own health and also population health. Well, I think in short, it's probably, is it too much to say, I wonder? Rhetorical question, perhaps. It perhaps has, the COVID-19 pandemic, transformed a lot of the way that we do think about our own individual responsibility for our own health, as well as how we think about what we should be doing and not doing and so on, and how that then affects other people, if that makes some sense. So I think the pandemic has perhaps reshaped, or it's underscored really our own individual responsibilities, I think, for most people, as well as how that relates to the bigger picture, how it helps other people to protect themselves, so how other people can, through their own actions, protect themselves better. So I think there's a relationship there between individual responsibility, but also collective responsibility. And I think I just want to emphasize the collective responsibility bit. That might get lost. We are, in certain respects, and it's not, through this paper, I'm not saying that there isn't individual responsibility, there shouldn't be, but things are more complicated than they may be rendered in law and policy documents. And there needs the scope for revising notions of responsibility in those documents so that they better reflect how people actually think about their own responsibility and broader social or common responsibilities. And I think that's for the benefit of just ensuring more legitimate healthcare and a healthcare system and public health responses to all sorts of matters, and not just COVID. Did that make sense?